I recently made a new tail for my Karlach cosplay and I wanted to share with you all how I did it. So this was the first tail that I ever made, and I feel as though it was some kind of concoction that I made up in a con crunch fever dream. I'm just going to talk about why I wouldn't recommend doing this method and why the new method is significantly better. I originally used a foam cover for pipes that go outside, foam clay at the end. The top half was a belt that I made, and then it's kind of got this horrific underside. And then there was the whole contraption underneath, which was a connection of like aluminium wire. Anyway, we don't want to spend too much time on that because, well, it was going to be a tricky one until I stumbled upon leafydragon.cos's page, and she'd shared how she'd made her tiefling tail. Huge shout out and thank you for the inspiration on how I then made my Karlach tail, because it helped astronomically. The key ingredient for this tail that you're going to need is upholstery foam. This is... oh, it's disgusting. That's what that is. And you're going to want it in probably a metre and... well, depending on how tall you are, either a metre, metre and a half. I think I did actually make my tail a little bit too long, so there is that, and I think in the future I will be going back and cutting down the length of the tail. I walked into my local shop, which is an interesting place. It's like an antiques dealer, but they also sell upholstery foam. But anyway, I can't complain because I got mine for literally £2. Oh yes, because they had some offcuts. So if you have got a local supplier, then you can always go and see if they might have anything similar in your area. I just essentially asked for the highest density upholstery foam that they had in stock, and as you can see, it is still really quite flexible. Without further ado, let's get into how I made it. You'll want to think about the layout of the tail. I made a diagonal cut about a third of the way up the final length of the tail and swapped the pieces around to create a very blocky curve, which I'm trying to demo here on these two smaller pieces. This is to help the tail not completely point straight down, but it's not necessary to do this if you don't wish to. You will want to use glue to then stick these pieces back together. I used hot glue, but contact cement can also be used. However, it is very toxic, so if you go that route, please use a respirator and be in a well-ventilated area. Once you've stuck those pieces together and the glue has cooled down or dried, it's time to start snipping away with some scissors. I didn't film the process of me cutting the tail as it would have been a very long and boring video to watch, but this is the triangular tip of the tail I'm doing here. Fair warning, this took about 3 evenings of just doing this, and if you do the same, I strongly recommend wearing gloves to avoid getting a blister from the scissors. I definitely found out the hard way. In terms of shaping the foam, I found slightly diagonal cuts were the best way to go. If you cut a chunk a bit too deeply and it ends up with high ridges, you can carefully do some smaller, shallower cuts to even it out. Luckily, upholstery foam is fairly forgiving. Now, I started hacking away at the foam like a rabid raccoon to turn it into a tubular shape, but you can mark out some lines in a Sharpie to give you a visual guide so you don't cut too far into the shape that you're making, or create a paper template to transfer your markings onto the foam. Once you're happy with the general shape, you can add the triangular piece on the end of the tail, and to make positioning a bit easier, you can use some masking tape to hold it in place and mark around it. Then glue it onto the main part of the tail. Finish up the shaping around the pieces until you're happy. To add in some extra posability, not actually a word, you can use aluminium craft wire and insert it into the base of the tail. I put wire into mine just over a third of the length of the tail. Using our trusty Sharpie again and onto the underside of the tail, draw a line where you want the craft wire to go. Then using a craft knife, make a shallow cut deep enough to take the wire but not so deep that it goes all the way through. Insert the wire into this cut and then glue it in place with your chosen gluing method. Pinching the foam around the wire helps to hide the seam. We can now pose the end of the tail however we like. To add some extra detail at the base of the tail, as Karlach's tail and a tiefling tails tend to have slightly ridged design, you'll want to use 1mm craft foam and make triangular pieces that wrap around the base and then layer over each other. I hot glued mine together as all one piece, but you can glue them on separately as you go. Then glue this in place on the tail. To cover the tail, you can use a pair of tights in your chosen colour, so as mine is for Karlach, I found this perfect pair of potter's clay tights. Cut out one of the legs, and by doing this along the seam, you can keep the second leg as a backup in case the first cover doesn't go as planned or for repairs in the future. Then put the tights over the tail and mark out where you will need to take in additional fabric. This is mainly around the tip of the tail and the base. For sewing machines, make sure to use stretch needles with stretch fabric and a zigzag stitch. The zigzag stitch allows the fabric to stretch and prevents the thread breaking and making a hole. Once you've sewn all the seams you're wanting to do, trim off any excess fabric. Then put the covering back onto the tail with the raw seams on the inside. Moving on to the base of the tail, hand stitch the ends of the tights closed. To be able to wear the tail, you will want a belt loop attachment and a belt. I used elastic for mine, but this turned out to be a bad idea, and I explain why in my final thoughts section at the end of this video, and an alternative option. Make sure they are big enough to go over your belt, and then hand stitch in position, and you're done. So in hindsight, the elastic on the end is really not kind of the best thing to use. It pulls too much and it makes it, like here, this is really tight, but when you're actually wearing it, it kind of sags and drops. So that's why I ended up adding this sort of aluminium craft wire last minute, just the night before the con, just because I just didn't have time to change it. However, I've since learned that you should probably either use non-stretch material for the belt loops, or you can also punch a hole all the way through the foam, like maybe sort of an inch in, and then thread your belt through there. So I think that's something that I will be doing in the future. So let's continue. Another hot tip that I have as well is to make sure that the seam is on the inside of the tail rather than on the outside. So that means that you get nice smooth, or as smooth a finish as possible. However, for the very end of the tail, I do have a slight seam just here, because getting this shape to go around the end of the foam was quite tricky. Another nice little detail that you can also add is putting in some shading as well. I think it just helps to like bring it a little bit more lifelike, adds a bit more detail. So there you have it. You have one very sexy, pretty awesome, very cheap, easy to make tiefling tail. Happy crafting! Yeah. Excuse me. It's been a long day. A right angle. There you go. Natural movement that the upholstery foam like gives. It makes it nice and waggly.